Chapter 9. The Theory and Practice of Fascism. On a superficial view, the theory and practice of fascism might appear to resemble closely Gibbon's famous definition of the theory and practice of the medieval Catholic Church, defending nonsense by violence. But in fact, as there has already been occasion to emphasize, there is a highly rational method in the nonsense, no less than in the violence. And commenting, author Michael Parenti would later echo this sentiment in the title of his book, Black Shirts and Reds, Rational Fascism and the Overthrow of Communism. The content of fascism, in other words, is irrational, but the reasons why it's put forward are rational. It is rationally deployed as a weapon of the bourgeoisie against its class enemies. Continuing, behind the ranting megalomaniacs, bullies, drug fiends, and broken-down bohemians, who constitute the outer facade of fascism, the business heads of finance capital who pay the costs and pull the strings are perfectly cool, clear, and intelligent. And it is with the real system of fascism in this sense, rather than with the imaginary ideology created to gull the innocent, that we are here concerned. The second, the professed fantastic ideology, is only of importance in relation to the first, the real system for the maintenance of capitalism in conditions of extreme crisis and weakening. And commenting, they would really like nothing more than for you to spend all of your time getting wrapped up in details of that and debating it until you're blue in the face. But it, in and of itself, is really, there's nothing to it. It's just a bunch of nonsense, mystical, irrational, and really designed to be a trap. It's designed to confuse, it's designed to demoralize, it's designed to occupy you so that you don't look toward the people who are actually making the decisions, pulling the strings according to a quite different, and again rational plan for trying to maintain capitalism as it goes through various breakdown crises. Continuing. Section 1. Is there a, quote, theory of fascism? The first illusion that requires to be cleared out of the way is the illusion that there is a theory of fascism, in the same sense that there is a theory of liberalism, conservatism, communism, etc. Many intellectuals, while deploring the excesses of fascism, allowed themselves to be fascinated and drawn into elaborate speculative discussion of the, quote, philosophy of fascism. And they are soon lost in the Serbonian bog of alternating, quote, socialism, pseudo-socialism, capitalism, corporatism, strongman worship, high moral adjurations and platitudes, anti-alien agitation, that would be anti-immigrant agitation, appeals to, quote, unity, glorifications of war, torture gloating, deification of primitive man, denunciations of big business, idolization of captains of industry, kicking of the dead corpse of the 19th century, and, quote, liberal democratic humanitarian superstitions, exhumation of the considerably more putrescent corpses of mercantilism, absolutism, inquisitorial methods and caste conceptions, racial theories of the inferiority of all other human beings save the speaker's own tribe, anti-Semitism, Nordicism, and all the rest of it. Comment. Congrats, you just described 2020's YouTube. Continuing, the innocent may solemnly and painstakingly discuss at face value these miscellaneous, quote, theories provided to suit all tastes, but in fact, their importance is rather as symptoms and byproducts of the real system and basis of fascism than as its origin and reason for being. The reality of fascism is the violent attempt of decaying capitalism to defeat the proletarian revolution and forcibly arrest the growing contradictions of its whole development. Let's read that again. The reality of fascism is the violent attempt of decaying capitalism to defeat the proletarian revolution and forcibly arrest the growing contradictions of its, fascism's or advanced monopoly capitalism, imperialism, its whole development. That is fundamentally what it really is, what really is its drive, what really makes it tick. Continuing, all the rest is decoration and stage play, whether conscious or unconscious, to cover and make presentable or attractive this basic reactionary aim, which cannot be openly stated without defeating its purpose. For this reason, the real scientific theory underlying fascism can better be studied in such a document as the Deutsche Führerbriefe, or Confidential Bulletins of the Federation of German Industries, already quoted in the previous chapter, rather than in the propaganda statements for public consumption concerning its professed theories by the fascist leaders themselves. comment, because again, that stuff is nonsense. It's spewed out for public consumption, to lead people in circles, to lead them away from fighting capitalism, etc. But the real drive is go into those business documents. That's where you're going to find the real plans and policies, not the stuff that is put out, again, to mislead the public by these spokespeople. Continuing, the confidential statement of the heads of finance capital defines plainly and without disguise the objective essence and purpose of fascism as seen by its actual paymasters and controllers, and is therefore of primary scientific and theoretical importance for the real understanding of fascism. Such a statement makes plain that fascism is solely a tactical method of finance capital, in exactly the same way as the support of democratic forms and of social democratic governments was also a tactical method, either being supported with equal readiness according to circumstances, again, to defeat the proletarian revolution, to divide the exploited population, and so to maintain capitalist rule. Comment, at a time when maintaining capitalist rule is becoming more and more difficult. Continuing, all the propaganda quote theories, mythological trimmings, supposed new school of political thought, etc., only constitute a smokescreen to cover this aim. We have already seen, in the course of the inquiry What is Fascism in the 4th chapter, how empty and meaningless are all the infinite attempted definitions of fascism by its leading exponents. The more these definitions are examined and analyzed, the more they resolve themselves into a string of commonplaces and platitudes by no means peculiar to fascism. Quote, the common interest before self, which is the basis of the German National Socialist program. Duty, heroism, the conception of the state as an absolute, which was one of Mussolini's lines. An organic and historical conception of society, according to Rocco, a conception which leans neither to the right nor the left. Heard that one before from libertarians today. The cooperation of all classes. The coordinated development of all national resources for the common good, according to Villari. A high conception of citizenship. The modern movement. The faith of those who ever since the war, World War I, have realized that the old system was dead and that a new system must be created. The system of the next stage of civilization. The creed and morality of British manhood, according to Mosley. Orderly government. National discipline, coordinated progress, a creed of justice and solidarity, social Christianity, according to the Black Shirt, a return to statesmanship, the national observance of duty toward others, less a policy than a state of mind, according to the Fascist, etc., etc. These and the like wind-filled phrases revolve without end through all the propagandist explanations of fascism. There is, it is true, one professedly definite and specific content put forward, namely, the much advertised corporate state. But further analysis in a subsequent section will show that this conception is actually as empty and hollow as the rest. This vagueness and ambiguity of conventional commonplaces to describe its basic aims is not accidental in fascism, but inherent and inevitable. This terminology is the standard vague and deceitful terminology of all capitalist parties to cover the realities of class rule and class exploitation under empty phrases of the community, the national welfare, the state above classes, etc. It is the familiar terminology of a MacDonald, a Henderson, or of Fabianism in the labor movement to defeat the aims of socialism and cover servitude to capitalism. It is the familiar terminology of a Baldwin or a Lloyd George, of a Tardieu or a Laval, of a Hindenburg or a Welles. In the use of these threadbare cliches of capitalist politics to describe its aims, fascism differs not a whit from the other capitalist parties, from conservatism, liberalism, or laborism, all of which would readily accept all the formulas quoted above. By this identity, fascism not only reveals its theoretical poverty and emptiness, but also reveals its basic identity of aims with the other capitalist parties. Fascism differs from the other capitalist parties only in its particular methods, in its practice, to realize the same basic aims. Comment, and that's consistent with the earlier statement about how fascism is just a different tactic. It's not fundamentally different. Continuing, there is, in short, despite all the inflated claims and attempts to the contrary, no distinctive theory of fascism in the sense of a distinctive scientific system of doctrines and world outlook. There is only a practice, and to cover this practice, a medley of borrowed plumes of any and every theory, principle, or institution which may serve the purpose of the moment, often with the utmost consequent theoretical contradiction, e.g. in racial theories, between one fascism and another. To mistake the borrowed plumage for the bird means to fail to understand the essence of fascism. Or, to vary the metaphor, the warning may be addressed to those who seek, in all innocence, to study the highly, quote, ideal and, quote, spiritual explanations of the, quote, theoretical basis of fascism, that to mistake the sheep's hide for the wolf means to reveal oneself in truth a sheep and fit prey for the wolf. Fascism grew up in historical fact as a movement without a theory. That is to say, it grew up in reality as a negative movement, employing mixed national chauvinist and pseudo-revolutionary slogans in opposition to the proletarian revolution. That is really why it came into being, and mainly distinguished by the use of violent and extra-legal methods against the proletarian movement. Only later, after over 2 years of existence, when it became clear that in order to appear fully dressed and equipped as a party and movement, it required to have a, quote, philosophy. In 1921, the fascist leadership gave orders for a suitable philosophy to be created. In August 1921, in preparation for the 1921 Congress, Mussolini wrote, quote, "Italian fascism now requires, under pain of death or worse of suicide, to provide itself with a body of doctrines." The expression is a rather strong one, but I would desire that within the 2 months between now and the National Congress, the philosophy of fascism must be created, unquote. That is low-key hilarious when you really think about it. Within 2 months, the philosophy of fascism must be created. The new, quote, philosophy is ordered as simply as a wagon load of black sticks. The spirit of this is no doubt magnificent in the style of a Selfridge's or Whitley's Emporium, ready to provide anything at a moment's notice, including even a brand new philosophy, if desired. But it is not the spirit of a genuine or serious movement with roots. In the same way, we may note Hitler's explanation that a new world theory was necessary as the sole means to combat the world theory of Marxism. Quote, "Every attempt to combat a world theory by means of force comes to grief in the end, so long as the struggle fails to take the form of aggression in favor of a new intellectual conception. It is only when two world theories are wrestling on equal terms that brute force, persistent and ruthless, can bring about a decision by arms in favor of the side which it supports." So comment, what's Hitler saying? If there's a world theory you don't like, you can't fight it by force alone. You also have to fight it on the level of its being a world theory. And then you can bring about a decision by arms. Continuing, it was on this side that the fight against Marxism had failed up to that time. It was the reason why Bismarck's legislation regarding socialism failed in the end in spite of everything, and was bound to fail. It lacked the platform of a new world theory to establish which fight might have been fought. For only the proverbial wisdom of high state officials could find it possible to imagine that the twaddle about so-called state authority or order and tranquility are sufficient inducement to fight to the death. In 1914, a contest against social democracy was in fact conceivable, but the lack of any practical substitute made it doubtful how long such a contest could have been maintained successfully. In that respect, there was a serious blank, unquote. And commenting, I mean, it's nice and all that you're trying to fight it on that level. The problem is that capitalism was in fact bankrupt by this point, so all such efforts would still be futile anyway. Continuing, Hitler, or the writer of this passage, is here perfectly correct in placing his finger on the weakness of the fight against Marxism. But his correctness is the correctness of a cunning tactician, not of a world thinker or historical leader. Marxism is strong and invincible because of its world theory. Therefore, we must also create a world theory in order to defeat it, such is the reasoning. Once again, only the negative approach to Marxism dictates the ideology and the demand for it. Marxism remains the sole positive, dominating force, comment, which could actually provide a future. It is obvious that no world theory comes into existence in this fashion, but only a substitute for one. The sensation of a, quote, new ideology which intoxicates the more fanatical and emotional adherents of fascism, giving them the illusion of a liberation from old superstitions and a new dynamic power, represents in reality no new ideology distinct from the general ideology of capitalism, but only the typical ideology of the most modern phase of capitalism. That is to say, the sharpened expression of all the tendencies of imperialism or capitalism in decay in the period of the general crisis. The contempt for constitutional and legalist forms, the glorification of violence, the denial of all liberal, egalitarian, and humanitarian ideas, the demand for the strong and powerful state, the enthronement of war as the highest form of human activity, all these are the typical expressions of modern monopolist capitalism. They are not peculiar to fascism, they are only expressed with greater brutality by fascism. In the poems of a Kipling, in the Boer War agitation of a Daily Mail, in the war dictatorship of a Lloyd George riding roughshod over constitutional forms and driving to the aim of a knockout blow, the spirit of fascism is already present in embryonic forms. And indeed, fascism grew historically out of war agitation and under the guiding inspiration of the army authorities in both Italy and Germany. There is nothing original or creative in fascism. Let's say that again. There is nothing original or creative in fascism. Not one single creative idea or achievement can be traced to fascism. The critique of liberalism and of liberal capitalist democracy, with its hollow contradiction between the formal sovereign, quote, citizenship and the reality of wage slavery, is borrowed from Marx. But Marx's conclusion, which alone justifies the criticism by pointing the path forward to the stage when the abolition of classes will make the formal citizenship real, is omitted. For in fascism, the hollow contradiction between the formal citizenship and the reality of wage slavery remains, just as in liberalism, save with heavier coercion and subjection to maintain it. The pseudo-revolutionary trappings, the sham stage conquest of power, the new form of government based on a single party running throughout the entire population is twisted with servile imitation from a caricature of the Russian Revolution turned upside down. But even the caricature cannot be reproduced in the end, for while the idea of a single party leadership is borrowed, but of an autocratic, not a democratic party, the key of the system, the Soviets, or the drawing of the masses directly into the work of government through their own elected organs from below, cannot be copied even in caricature. On the contrary, even the previously elected municipal councils have to be abolished and replaced by the arbitrary rule of the nominated podesta or prefect, or in Germany by the nominated state commissary imposed from above, and overruling even nominal elected forms. The theory of economic state regulation of privately owned industry and of class collaboration in the, quote, corporate state, that is, of syndicated state-controlled capitalism with a dash of sham labor representation, is borrowed from the entire modern development of monopolist capitalism in all countries. In particular, these are the typical theories of modern liberalism and social democracy, with their organized capitalism, national planning boards, national economic councils, joint industrial councils, and all the rest of the apparatus of theories and institutions which have developed continuously and increasingly in the imperialist era, and more especially since the war, before fascism ever existed. Finally, the national chauvinist ideology, the anti-Semitism, and the racial theories are all borrowed without a single new feature from the stock in trade of the old conservative and reactionary parties, as utilized by a Bismarck or Tsar Nicholas and made familiar in the propaganda of the Pan-Germans or Pan-Slavists. And there's a footnote here. Modern anti-Semitism developed from Germany and Austria in the 1870s, that is, as capitalism was beginning to pass from the liberal epoch toward the imperialist epoch. In 1873 appeared Mars, Der Sieg des Judentums über das Germantum, or The Victory of Jewry over Germanism. Quote, "It is impossible to doubt," writes Lucian Wolff, former president of the Jewish Historical Society in England, quote, "that the secret springs of the new agitation were more or less directly supplied by Prince Bismarck himself," unquote. It is worth noting that a Christian Social Workingmen's Union, the worthy forerunner of the National Socialist Workers' Party, was founded in this period by Stocker, a court chaplain, which preached a program of so-called Christian socialism, which was in practice anti-Semitism, dished up with denunciations of financial corruption and organized street riots and bloodshed. It was with reference to this movement that the elder Liebknecht spoke of anti-Semitism as the, quote, socialism of fools. The anti-Semite agitation spread from Germany to Russia in the beginning of the 80s, again directly inspired and stimulated from above. Quote, "The modern anti-Semitic element," writes Lucian Wolff, "came from above. It has been freely charged against the Russian government that it promoted the riots in 1881 in order to distract attention from the nihilist propaganda. This seems to be true of General Ignatieff, then Minister of the Interior, and of the Secret Police," unquote. The conscious anti-revolutionary, anti-socialist, and officially inspired character of the movement thus stands out in every case. In France, Drumont's La France Juive appeared in 1886, and the anti-Dreyfus scandal, promoted by all the high military and bureaucratic authorities with wholesale forgeries, dragged from 1894 to 1906. Only British capitalism, which in its period of stability could make a conservative Jew prime minister and ennoble Jewish millionaires in abundance, had for long no use for the primitive devices of anti-Semite demagogy. But today the signs begin to spread in Britain in close association with the spread of fascism. Thus, the Black Shirt, 1933, issue number 23, prints on its front page under the heading, "Britain for the British." That sounds familiar. The alien menace. Quote, "The low type of foreign Jew, together with other aliens who are debasing the life of this nation, will be run out of the country in double quick time under fascism." Unquote. Anti-Semitism, the typical degrading expression of a tottering system, is developed by capitalism in its decaying stage, in proportion as the class struggle grows acute. Comment, in other words, the more that the workers are empowered and the class struggle is intensifying, the more the capitalists, already in power and trying to preserve that power, need to try to divert the masses onto something else. Racial struggle, national struggle, anti-Semitism is a typical standby. Back to the main text. The whole outlook and ideology of fascism is, in short, nothing but a ragbag of borrowings from every other source to cover the realities and practice of modern monopolist capitalism in the period of crisis and of extreme class war. There is not a single creative idea. Capitalism in its time, in its early progressive days, did achieve a great constructive work and carried enormously forward the whole of human culture in every field. The French Revolution spread a new life and a new understanding throughout the world, the outcome of which we can today be proud to inherit, even though we are today able to understand that its bourgeois basis inevitably set a limit to what it could achieve. The Russian Revolution opened a new era on a scale exceeding every previous change in human history, the full extent of which is still only beginning to be realized. But fascism has produced nothing and can produce nothing, for fascism is the expression only of disease and death. Section 2. Demagogy as a Science. Quoting Al Capone, "Bolshevism is knocking at our gates. We can't afford to let it in. We have got to organize ourselves against it and put our shoulders together and hold fast. We must keep America whole and safe and unspoiled. We must keep the worker away from red literature and red ruses. We must see that his mind remains healthy." Unquote. Thank you, Al Capone. The above quotation from Al Capone is a suitable introduction to the anti-communist ideology of fascism. The earnestness of this appeal of a thief and gangster to maintain existing society, quote, unspoiled in face of the communist menace, might appear at first blush comic, but in fact it is purely reasonable. None have more sincere concern and zeal than thieves to maintain the institution of private property, without which their profession would come to an end, and they would find themselves faced with the unpleasant alternative of having to work for their living. On the other hand, they cannot publicly proclaim the principles of thievery and gangsterism as the basis of their stand. For public purposes, they have to proclaim the most high moral principles, to maintain existing society, quote, unspoiled, and to keep, quote, the mind of the worker, quote, healthy. Comment, do today's anti-communists and anti-socialists sound any different, and are they any less gangster? Continuing, this high moral tone runs through all fascist propaganda and accompanies their gangster exploits. Nor should this be thought a contradiction. The two characteristics invariably run together in periods of decay. As Plekhanov has remarked in Fundamental Problems of Marxism, quote, Marx said very truly that the greater the development of antagonism between the growing forces of production and the existing or extant social order, the more does the ideology of the ruling class become permeated with hypocrisy. In addition, the more effectively life unveils the mendacious or deceptive character of this ideology, the more does the language used by the dominant class become sublime and virtuous. This shrewd remark is confirmed by what is going on today in Germany. The spread of debauchery disclosed by the Harden-Moltke trial proceeds hand in hand with the, quote, revival of idealism in sociology, unquote. The process noted by Plekhanov has gone considerably further in Germany and in all capitalist society today. The fact that many of the principal leaders of German fascism are not only notorious drug fiends and perverts, but express themselves in their writings with highly jocular gusto over their exploits of tortures of women and particularly revolting murders. See, for example, the writings of von Killinger, who was appointed by Hitler Commissar for Saxony and Minister-President. While in their program, they demand the protection of the, quote, morals and sense of decency of the German race. This is no contradiction, but only a further exemplification of the general rule. Footnote here, quoting from Calvin B. Hoover's Germany Enters the Third Reich, 1933, quote, von Killinger was made Commissar for Saxony and later Minister-President, and he consequently was in charge of Gleichschaltung in this state. He had previously written a little book, Ernstes und Heiteres aus dem Putschleben, in which he recounts, among other incidents, how in the campaign against the Soviet government in Munich, he had a soldier whip a young, quote, wench with a horsewhip, quote, until there was not a white spot left on her backside, unquote. He also recounts how, after a communist street agitator had made an impudent reply to a threat, he had a soldier toss a hand grenade at the man. He recounts with gusto the gory details of the man's death, unquote. Leaders of this type have invariably been given especially high positions in German fascism, and I would say American policing. Many similar exploits could be recounted of the notorious Rosses of Mussolini in Italy, of Finnish fascism, of Hungarian fascism, etc. This characteristic is a general characteristic of fascism, and it follows inevitably from the type of work it has to do. Back to the main text. The mystical and openly non-rational character of fascist ideology and propaganda is only the inevitable expression of its class role to maintain the domination of a doomed and decaying class. The present situation of world capitalism is in the highest degree irrational. It is not rational that foodstuffs should be destroyed while millions are undernourished, that building workers should be unemployed while housing becomes more and more overcrowded and inadequate, sounds a little familiar today, that the masses should have to economize and go short because there is too much plenty, or that learned economists should discuss anxiously the, quote, menace of a good harvest or the, quote, hopes of a bad harvest. But all this is inherent in the present stage of capitalism. Therefore, capitalism can no longer defend itself on rational grounds, as it used to do in its early days, when it argued that its system, though cruel, meant the maximum development of natural resources and the maximum material well-being. Today, such arguments are dismissed as low, materialistic, utilitarian, merely rational arguments unworthy of higher human nature, characteristic of the exploded 19th century outlook and long replaced by 20th century, quote, spirituality and the, quote, revival of idealism. Today, capitalism defends itself on mystical grounds. Race, the nation, Christianity, spirituality, the mystery of patriotism, faith. This is the language of the modern defenders of capitalism, and in particular, of fascism. Let's read that again. Today, capitalism defends itself on mystical grounds. Race, the nation, Christianity, spirituality, the mystery of patriotism, faith. This is the language of the modern defenders of capitalism, and in particular, of fascism. Thus, Mussolini, in defending fascism, speaks with contempt of doctrine and exalts faith. Quoting from Mussolini's The Political and Social Doctrine of Fascism, quote, doctrine, beautifully defined and carefully elucidated, with headlines and paragraphs, not paragraphs, might be lacking, but there was to take its place something more decisive, faith, unquote. Gentile, the philosopher of fascism, defines the fascist state as a, quote, wholly spiritual creation. Hitler defines the state as, quote, nothing to do with any definite economic conception or economic development, just vibing, but, quote, the organization of a community homogeneous in nature and feeling for the better furtherance and maintenance of their type and the fulfillment of the destiny marked out for them by capital P Providence, unquote. The British Union of Fascists, in its short definition of fascism, declares, quote, we believe in the cooperation of all classes, in the solidarity of all units of a nation, and in justice, and in the mystery of patriotism, unquote. Bottomley, in his wartime speeches and articles, had many similar exalted passages. This type of ideal, spiritual language is the familiar language of all scoundrels, rogues, war profiteers, gangsters, Kreugers, Al Capones, Morgans, McDonalds, Mussolinis, Hitlers, Romanovs, and all who live by preying on their fellow human beings and cannot face a plain, rational, materialist examination of their role and of the organization of society. On this exaltation of mystical feeling above reason, whether national feeling, religious feeling, racial feeling, etc., as the ultimate basis, Hegel, himself philosophically an idealist but of a more solid type, and therefore by his system laying the groundwork for the subsequent dialectical materialism, wrote with incisive contempt in Phenomenology of Mind, quote, "By referring to his feelings, his inward oracle, he thinks he has a sufficient answer to those who do not agree with him. He must declare that he has nothing more to say to those who do not share the same feelings. In other words, he tramples underfoot the roots of humanity. For the nature of this is to seek agreement with others, and it exists only in the community of consciousness that has been brought about. The inhuman, the brute, consists in being guided only by feeling and being able to communicate only through feelings." Unquote. He tramples underfoot the roots of humanity. This pregnant saying applies to all the racial, mystical, non-rational, anti-humanitarian, anti-international ideologies of fascism, and the result in every case is the same, to lead only to the inhuman, the brute. The truth is, the propaganda of fascism is essentially demagogy carried to its most extreme point of development. It might indeed be said that if Marxism represented the development of socialism from utopia to science, fascism represents the development of capitalist demagogy from amateurdom to science. Already before fascism, the precursors of the modern age, Northcliffe, Lloyd George, Bottomley, Hearst, and others, had done much to point the way and lay down the general lines and methods, but these were still erratic and individualist in character, and they never solved completely the complicated and contradictory problem of building up a reactionary mass movement, at once, quote, popular, pseudo-popular in form, and anti-popular in content. So commenting, that is like the essence of what we talked about in Black Shirts and Reds, or in the writings of Claret Zetkin, really any time that fascism comes up. There is outwardly a kind of aping, an imitation of the symbols and forms of a mass movement as exemplified in the growing proletarian movement. So you're copying what the people are doing and what the people are thinking and what they're interested in and how that gets expressed. But you're actually changing the content so that it is anti-popular, against the interests of the people, and so on. There are a lot of really backward people trying to understand, quote, geopolitics today, who are really still falling for conservative rhetoric, but calling it socialism, and congrats, you are doing exactly this thing that the fascists are trying to get you to do. Continuing, Hitler expresses generously his gratitude to his predecessors, especially Northcliffe, Lloyd George, and British wartime propaganda, which Hitler acknowledges as his model that he learned from, admiring its, quote, psychological superiority. He admires particularly the idea of pretending to fight for the freedom of little nations as a far superior motive to lead men to their death, rather than telling them the real aims of the war. He praises Lloyd George highly as a great demagogue, whose, quote, primitiveness is, quote, proof of towering political capacity. But in fact, fascism was to leave these models far behind in its systematization of playing on every backward feeling, instinct, and ignorance in the population, in the unscrupulousness of its programs thrown out to appeal to any and every section without pretense of regard for consistency, and in the brazenness of its sudden changes of front and repudiation of its own programs. What is demagogy? The ruling classes will apply the epithet demagogue to every revolutionary leader of the masses who awakens them to the struggle to overthrow their oppressors, as realized at its highest in a Lenin or a Liebknecht. Such appellation is a glaring misuse of language, for the relation of the revolutionary leader to the masses is based on the strictest regard for objective truth, whether popular or unpopular, and the most consistent and unwavering prosecution of the interests of the mass struggle for liberation against all opposition, however powerful. Demagogy, on the other hand, is the art of playing on the hopes and the fears, the emotions and the ignorance of the poor and the suffering for the benefit of the rich and the powerful. It is the meanest of the arts. This is the art of fascism. An examination of the programs of Italian and of German fascism will show the systematization of this method, which is being painstakingly copied today by British fascism. It is unnecessary to go into the earlier period of Mussolini himself, as when in 1910 he declared that, quote, the proletariat has no fatherland, nor in truth has the bourgeoisie. In case of war, we socialists will not go to the front. We will raise insurrection within our own borders," unquote. Or when in 1912 he denounced Bissolati for treason in having acclaimed the king whose servitor he was to become. This is only the common record of all the corrupt Western European social democratic politicians, of the Millerans and Briands, of the MacDonalds and Snowdens. It is more important to begin with the early program of Italian fascism in 1919 to 22 before power. The early program of Italian fascism was, in the words of an official spokesman of fascism, Professor G. Volpe, professor of modern history in the University of Milan, in the yearbook of the International Center of Fascist Studies for 1928, quote, "a nebulous program at first, somewhat demagogic and revolutionary," unquote. It contained items of the following type: abolition of the monarchy, senate, and nobility, republic, and universal suffrage to elect a constituent assembly as an Italian section of the International Constituent Assembly of the Peoples, international disarmament and abolition of compulsory military service, confiscation of church property, confiscation of war superprofits and capital levy, abolition of the stock exchange and dissolution of limited liability companies and banks, land for the peasants, transference of control of industry to syndicates of technicians and workers. Italian fascism systematically applauded the occupation of factories by workers, food riots, strikes, peasant land seizures, etc., and called for the hanging of speculators from lampposts and similar measures. It is only necessary to examine this program of fascism in comparison with its record in power to understand the meaning of demagogy. Drain the swamp. In comparison with fascism, the average, quote, old gang politician's record of election promises and subsequent violation is innocent child's play and almost honest by contrast. Political history in all its range from a Machiavelli to a Tammany Hall knows no parallel of brazen dishonesty to equal fascism. Footnote there, the examples of this record in every field are too abundant and commonplace to be worth detailed review. Thus, on the question of republicanism, Mussolini wrote in the Popolo d'Italia on May 24, 1921, quote, "I shall not allow fascism to be altered and made unrecognizable by changing from republican in tendency, as I founded it, and as it ought to remain, to a monarchical, nay more a dynastic movement. Our symbol is not the scutcheon of the House of Savoy. It is not permissible to preach one thing and practice another," unquote. On the very next day, when the controlling capitalist and landed elements in fascism insisted on the withdrawal of this Republican declaration, Mussolini at once obediently wrote, quote, "Fascism is superior to monarchy and republic. The future is uncertain, and the absolute does not exist. Those who would draw the conclusion that fascism espouses the Republican cause and regards the setting up of the Republic as a prime necessity reveal a lamentable want of understanding," unquote. On the question of religion, Mussolini wrote on April 3, 1921, quote, "Fascism is the strongest of all heresies that strikes at the door of the churches. Away with these temples that are doomed to destruction, for our triumphant heresy is destined to illumine all hearts and brains," unquote. In his encyclopedia article on fascism in 1932, he wrote, quote, "In the fascist state, religion is considered as one of the deepest manifestations of the spirit of man. Thus it is not only respected, but defended and protected," unquote. These examples could be continued indefinitely, and are only of importance as the demonstration that fascism cannot be interpreted in terms of its own alleged political, quote, theories, but only in terms of its service to finance capital. Back to the main text. The program of German National Socialism surpassed that of Italian fascism in unblushing demagogy. Here, in the more advanced stage of development of Germany, it was necessary for fascism to proclaim the aim of, quote, socialism. The Krupps and the Thyssens, the Daterdings and the Hohenzollerns paid out their money to spread the propaganda of, quote, socialism. The 25 Points Program, adopted in 1920 and proclaimed by the 1926 Congress to be, quote, unalterable, set out the following aims among its miscellaneous medley of items: abolition of unearned income, breaking of interest slavery, confiscation of all war profits, nationalization of all trusts, profit sharing in large concerns, confiscation without compensation of land for communal purposes, and the death penalty for usurers and profiteers. The meaning of these high-sounding, quote, revolutionary and, quote, socialistic aims was left deliberately obscure. It is reported that 2 earnest students and devotees of National Socialism, having approached Goebbels for an explanation how the famous 11th point on the breaking of interest slavery would be accomplished, received the reply that the only breaking likely to take place would be the heads of those who tried to understand it. Interpretation was, however, at a later stage brought into play in reference to one point, the 17th point on the confiscation of land without compensation. This demand had evidently caused alarm to the more stupid large landlords, who required an assurance in writing, while the more wily heads of big business and finance remained wholly unperturbed at the terrible sword of Damocles hanging over their heads in the shape of the nationalization of all trusts, abolition of unearned income, and the death penalty for profiteers. Accordingly, the following explanatory addition was officially inserted in the unalterable program in 1928. Quote, "It is necessary to reply to the false interpretation on the part of our opponents on point 17 of the program. Since the National Socialist German Workers' Party admits the principle of private property, it is obvious that the expression confiscation without compensation merely refers to possible legal powers to confiscate, if necessary, land illegally acquired or not administered in accordance with national welfare. It is directed in the first instance at the Jewish companies which speculate in land." Unquote. This specimen exercise in official interpretation speaks volumes for the real character of the whole program. At the same time, occasional assurances had in fact also to be given to some of the more hesitating capitalists. An official letter of this type, from the district party leadership in Dresden to a Weimar capitalist, who had hesitated to give financial support owing to the, quote, anti-capitalist propaganda conducted, and to whom it was officially explained that he should not be alarmed at the anti-capitalist, quote, catchwords, since these were only adopted, quote, for reasons of diplomacy, fell into the hands of the opponents of the Nazis in 1930 and was published. The text of this indiscreet letter ran as follows, quote, "Do not let yourself be continually confused by the text of our posters. Of course, there are catchwords like down with capitalism, etc., but these are unquestionably necessary, for under the flag of German national, or national alone, you must know, we should never reach our goal. We should have no future. We must talk the language of the embittered socialist workmen, or else they wouldn't feel at home with us." It sounds like some other YouTube channels I know of right now. "We don't come out with a direct program for reasons of diplomacy." This was quoting a letter of a Dresden party leader to the industrialist Fritzsche in Weimar, reprinted in Maurer, Germany Puts the Clock Back. This illuminating letter makes further comment on the real meaning of fascist demagogy, and its purpose superfluous.